Tonight, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada enters a phase that few policymakers publicly anticipated, but many privately feared. What unfolded over the past several days was not a sudden breakdown. It was the delayed consequence of a trade framework that has been under mounting strain for years. Canada's announcement today is not simply about tariffs. It is about leverage, credibility, and the future structure of North American manufacturing. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back. We need to examine how deeply integrated these two economies truly are, how fragile that integration has become, and why Canada chose this specific moment to act. For decades, the U.S.-Canada trade relationship was treated as fundamentally stable. Political disagreements came and went. Administrations changed, but the assumption remained the same. The economic bond would hold. NAFTA and EPA were built around predictability. Manufacturers invested billions under the assumption that borders would remain functionally invisible. Factories were built where efficiency demanded, not where politics dictated. Supply chains crossed borders repeatedly, sometimes half a dozen times before final assembly. Labor specialization increased, costs declined, and North America became globally competitive. But integration also created dependency. When production systems are optimized for efficiency, redundancy disappears. And when redundancy disappears, leverage shifts. Canada understands this dynamic very well. Over the last 18 months, Canadian policymakers quietly adjusted their assumptions. The shifts began in early 2025 as the U.S. moved toward a reciprocal tariff model. When the U.S. imposed a 25% duty on the non-U.S. content of vehicles, even those technically compliant with USMCA, the math for Canadian manufacturing changed overnight. Ottawa watched as Honda shifted CR-V production from Ontario to Indiana and Ohio to minimize the impact. They watched as Stellantis paused investments in Brampton to pivot toward U.S. expansion. The message was received. Internally, the strategy shifted. Trade negotiations were allowed to stall after the U.S. terminated talks in October over political friction. Diplomatic engagement increased with European and Asia-Pacific partners. Canadian manufacturers explored alternative sourcing, not to replace U.S. suppliers immediately, but to reduce exposure. Pension funds diversified industrial investments away from the United States. These were not defensive gestures, they were preparatory moves. Canada was building optionality, and in trade disputes, optionality is power. Over the last 72 hours, that preparation became visible. A series of coordinated decisions disrupted automotive supply chains across the American Midwest. Major manufacturers triggered emergency internal responses. And serious questions emerged about whether the integrated North American production model can survive prolonged trade friction. Canada's move represents escalation, but not chaos. It is calculated, targeted, controlled, and that is exactly what makes it consequential. The auto industry was not chosen by accident. It is the most integrated sector in North America, one of the most capital-intensive, and among the most politically sensitive. It is also the foundation of future industrial strategy. Electric vehicles, battery production, advanced manufacturing. By targeting automotive manufacturing, Canada applied pressure immediately. They disrupted future investment decisions at a critical juncture, and they concentrated political consequences in regions where manufacturing employment matters most. This is not emotional retaliation, it is leverage maximization. Early this morning, Canada's Ministry of Finance released a retaliatory tariff package targeting American automotive exports. The announcement itself was brief, technical, almost understated. The substance was not a 25% tariff on U.S.-made vehicles, a 25% tariff on automotive parts, a 25% tariff on steel components used in vehicle manufacturing. In addition, a 15% surcharge was imposed on vehicles containing components that benefited from U.S. government industrial subsidies. That final provision matters. It directly targets the Inflation Reduction Act. It targets the CHIPS and Science Act. It targets the core of recent American industrial policy. Canada's message was clear. Domestic subsidies do not end at the border. If American industrial policy disadvantages Canadian producers, Canada will impose costs to neutralize that advantage. They are effectively treating U.S. subsidies as a form of unfair trade practice that requires a balancing duty. Markets understood immediately. General Motors shares declined sharply. Ford initiated production reviews at multiple Midwest facilities. Stellantis issued internal advisories to suppliers, warning of rising costs and potential disruption. These were not public relations moves, they were internal risk controls. The kind companies activate when they expect sustained pressure, not temporary volatility. Canadian officials confirmed the tariffs took effect immediately. No transition period, no grace window. That decision matters. Contracts were already signed. Vehicles were already in transit. Supply chains were already committed. Costs had to be absorbed overnight. This was pressure by design. What separates this response from earlier trade disputes is precision. The tariffs focus on Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, states central to American automotive production. They affect facilities recently expanded for electric vehicle manufacturing. They hit battery and component networks critical to future competitiveness. Canada did not just target legacy production, it targeted growth. From Canada's perspective, this approach maximizes leverage, while minimizing self-inflicted damage. By exempting certain essential subcomponents not yet produced domestically, they kept their own assembly lines moving, while making U.S. finished exports uncompetitive. The pain is concentrated where political sensitivity is highest, and where long-term investment decisions are being made. From Washington's perspective, the response has been reactive. Officials criticized the tariffs as disproportionate. They warned of potential countermeasures. Tariffs on Canadian exports. Restrictions justified under national security provisions. But the leverage has shifted. The U.S. is currently preparing for the mandatory 2026 USMCA review. The clock is ticking toward July, and Canada just set the opening terms of that negotiation. That absence of an immediate offer to negotiate matters, because this dispute is not happening in isolation. Mexico has signaled it may review retaliatory options against American agricultural exports. The European Union has accelerated counter-tariffs on U.S. goods. Japan has increased regulatory scrutiny of American automotive imports under safety and compliance frameworks. Taken together, these actions suggest a global reassessment. Not isolated disagreement, but coordinated recalibration. For decades, the United States benefited from a global trade system built on predictability, dispute resolution, multilateral coordination. In recent years, that predictability has weakened. Tariffs imposed under national security claims. Trade agreements renegotiated under pressure. Subsidies introduced without coordination. Each move may make sense domestically. Collectively, they erode trust, and trade runs on trust. Economists now see several possible paths forward. One is negotiation. Both sides absorb short-term costs and return to the table before the USMCA review formally begins this month. This requires a climb down from the reciprocal rhetoric that has defined U.S. policy since 2024. Another is prolonged stalemate. Tariffs remain. Costs pass to consumers. Companies adjust slowly. Used car prices spike as new car affordability craters. In the U.S., the average price of a vehicle could rise by as much as $6,000 practically overnight. The third is structural decoupling. Supply chains are redesigned to reduce exposure. Efficiency declines, costs rise. North America becomes less competitive globally, even as it becomes more politically insulated. This is the Fortress North America model, but one divided into internal bunkers. Each outcome carries trade-offs. Negotiation restores stability, but requires compromise. Stalemate preserves leverage, but prolongs uncertainty. Decoupling reduces vulnerability, but undermines scale. What is already clear is that escalation will not remain abstract. Vehicle prices rise, production slows. Workers feel it first. Tariffs are not paid by governments, they are paid by companies. workers, consumers, quietly, over time. Trade disputes are rarely about winning. They are about leverage, credibility, long-term positioning. Canada has signaled it is willing to absorb short-term pain, to defend autonomy, and reduce dependency. The United States must now decide whether escalation strengthens its position or weakens it. The next few weeks matter. The meeting scheduled for mid-January between Minister Dominic LeBlanc and USTR Jameson Greer is no longer a routine briefing. It is a crisis summit. If negotiations resume, this moment may be remembered as a necessary recalibration. If escalation continues, it may mark the beginning of North American fragmentation. Either way, the implications extend far beyond trade policy. They will shape where factories are built, where workers are hired, and how competitive North American industry remains in a century defined by the energy transition. This moment will not be remembered for a single tariff announcement. It will be remembered for what followed. Whether cooperation prevailed or whether efficiency finally gave way to politics. We'll continue watching closely as the next phase unfolds.